not going to speculate about the president's decision-making on this matter. Suffice it to say, the nuclear question is the reason we're in this in the first place. They don't just seek to dominate Iran, they seek to dominate the region. Imagine that with a nuclear weapon. The White House said the president will only make a deal that's good for the American people and the world. The Strait of Hormuz sits at the center of a crisis that has quietly, and now not so quietly, reshaped geopolitics and global trade over the last 2 months. A narrow throat of sea through which roughly 1/5 of the world's oil flows has become the bargaining table for a protracted confrontation between the United States and Iran. A confrontation that has spilled into a wider regional standoff and pushed ordinary shipping and ordinary lives into limbo. On the water, the scene is simple and stark. Hundreds of commercial vessels anchored and waiting, tankers idling miles from their destinations, crews stranded, schedules appended, and companies weighing losses measured in millions of dollars a day. On land, the calculus is far more complex. Naval movements, dueling blockades, talks brokered in third-party capitals, and competing lists of demands that leave little room for compromise. And above all of it, the unchanging fact that control of that short strip of water gives enormous leverage over the flow of energy and goods from the Persian Gulf to the world. Field correspondents who have been moving between the Gulf capitals and the international naval task forces describe a cautious, brittle dynamic. There has been limited movement, not a return to normalcy, but signs that parts of the corridor can be reopened under certain political terms. Those first tentative transits are emblematic. A liquefied natural gas carrier that left the United Arab Emirates recently managed to transit the strait. It was described on the scene as the first such carrier to pass through since the air war began on February 28, 2026. That small passage is a reminder that, even in the worst moments, maritime routes can be partially reopened, but only on political terms and often only for a short window. The diplomacy around that passage has been frantic and brittle. Iran, after weeks of testing the limits of coercion at sea, from laying mines to stopping and inspecting vessels and, at times, firing on ships, reportedly offered negotiators a proposal: reopen the strait in exchange for a lifting of the U.S. blockade and a political commitment to push discussions on Iran's nuclear program to a later stage. In diplomatic shorthand, Tehran was asking for a ceasefire-style trade. The waterway for the timetable for Washington, that proposal landed like a test. U.S Iran landed like a test. Officials have described the nuclear question as the central matter, with senior diplomats in the White House resisting any deal that would let nuclear concerns be parked indefinitely. President Donald Trump's administration has framed its red lines as comprehensive: limits on enrichment, dismantling key facilities, removal of highly enriched uranium that might be used for weapons, and an end to funding for proxies that sow instability across the region. The White House line is blunt and public. The president will only sign a deal that, in their words, is good for the American people and the world. Into this diplomatic storm stepped one of the administration's most recognizable foreign policy voices. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who has played a prominent role in negotiations and in public briefings, was pressed about any potential acceptance of Tehran's offer. His answer was cautious in tone and pointed in emphasis, underlining the administration's insistence that the nuclear question cannot be ignored or deferred if any lasting peace is to be achieved. His warning was clear. The strategic ambitions behind Iran's moves in the region are not limited to provincial influence. The power 467 Tabat carry implications that would be dramatically amplified if coupled with a nuclear capability. On the military side, the U.S. has visibly tightened its posture. Over recent weeks, American naval forces have surged into the area east of the strait, sending additional carrier strike groups, surface combatants, and mine countermeasure vessels into waters long patrolled by regional navies and merchant convoys. One carrier, the USS George H.W. Bush, entered the U.S. Central Command area of responsibility in late April, joining other U.S. carriers operating in the broader region. The result is a concentration of American maritime power that senior defense officials say is designed to deter attacks on shipping and to enforce the interdiction of vessels that pay Iranian-imposed tolls. On the deck plates and among crews, the mood is professional resolve. In capitals, it is a visible signal that Washington intends to lean on maritime operations to shape Tehran's calculus, the blockade mode. Washington has adopted interdicting ships that pay Iranian tolls or otherwise try to move sanctioned cargo. has had practical effects. Iranian export volumes have been squeezed and Tehran's storage tanks have been reported as filling. That dynamic feeds two connective threads of analysis in Washington and allied capitals. First, as tanks approach capacity, Tehran runs the risk of being forced to cut production, a painful economic step that might increase pressure on Iranian leaders to negotiate. Second, if production is cut, world oil markets feel the effect, elevating prices and heightening the geopolitical stakes. U.S. officials have repeatedly argued that economic pressure, when combined with military deterrence and diplomatic isolation, can bend Tehran back toward a negotiated outcome, but that calculation is contingent and risky. Negotiations have gone through fits and starts. An initial 2-week ceasefire in early April opened a narrow corridor for diplomacy and a few commercial transits, but talks in Islamabad later that month collapsed without agreement. Pakistan had been attempting to mediate between the two sides, shuttling messages and at one point presenting Tehran's proposal to Washington. The failure of those sessions pushed the administration to take a firmer maritime line, and it has prompted Iran to shift tactics from purely deniable harassment to more visible displays of control over shipping lanes. So where does that leave merchant shipping and the companies whose balance sheets now include line items for delay, rerouting and risks? The short answer: in a painfully uncertain place. Many carriers have altered routes to skirt known trouble spots, and some smaller coastal operators have been forced to pivot to Atlantic or Mediterranean loadouts rather than rely on transits through the Gulf. Insurers and commodity traders are pricing in a future where the strait is sometimes open, sometimes closed, and sometimes impossible to predict. The practical result is higher shipping costs, longer delivery times, and a ribbon of inflationary pressure for energy-dependent industries around the world. The human toll is also measurable. Mariners who months ago rotated in and out of ports now face extended periods at sea or long layovers. Crews on ships that cannot leave ports are being stranded ashore without pay for work they cannot perform. Ports themselves, from Dubai to Bandar Abbas, have seen logistics slow and dock workers face uncertain schedules. These are the often unseen consequences of high politics. Back in Washington, the administration have been careful to signal firmness and flexibility. The president's public statements about the blockade and the need to hold firm on red lines reflect a political position calculated in part for domestic audiences as much as foreign ones. At the same time, the State Department continues to press allies and partners to help de-escalate, to offer naval escorts for Volney, enable commercial shipments when possible, and to coordinate intelligence and demining assistance to make transit safer. That last point, demining and safe passage guarantees, is where multilateral diplomacy has a realistic chance to produce a pragmatic, if imperfect, outcome. International proposals circulating among Gulf states and Western capitals have included a package of measures: coordinated mine-clearing operations, shared naval escorts for civilian convoys, intelligence sharing to spot covert interdiction attempts, and an international monitoring mechanism to ensure Iran is not using a partial reopening to mask ongoing nuclear progress. Tehran, for its part, has insisted that any guarantee must also address the economic pain that U.S. pressure has wrought, including a rollback of sanctions and an end to interdiction that it argues unfairly constrains its trade. For some analysts, the exchange proposed by Tehran, reopening the strait in return for shelving nuclear talks, it's a classic bargaining game. It buys Iran time to rebuild and fortify its economic position while extracting immediate relief. For the United States and partners, the danger is that agreeing to a trade that defers nuclear issues sacrifices long-term safety for short-term breathing room. Secretary Rubio's intervention, insisting the nuclear file remains central, was a timely reminder of that trade-off. At sea, the risk calculus has a kinetic dimension. Mines, drone attacks, or miscalculation could force commercial operators to stay away for longer, and even short, isolated interruptions have outsized effects on global markets. Some maritime analysts warn that the longer the dueling blockades and partial openings persist, the higher the chance a single misstep, a misfired weapon, a mistaken identification, a damaged commercial vessel spirals into broader confrontation. Others observe that the presence of multiple carrier strike groups and mine countermeasure ships makes large-scale escalation less likely because both sides understand the risks of a rapid kinetic spiral. For policymakers watching the clock, Iran's storage capacity is a tactical lever. If tanks truly near capacity in the coming weeks, Tehran could face hard choices: continue to store oil at mounting economic cost, ramp down production and accept immediate revenue losses, or extract concessions in a way that risks looking like a victory. That pressure plays directly into negotiating dynamics. U.S. officials have suggested explicitly that economic pressure and naval deterrence could produce leverage. But they also acknowledge the risk that Tehran may simply accept pain rather than make concessions on what it calls core sovereignty issues. What would a durable resolution look like? The ideal outcome from a Western perspective would combine verified nuclear constraints on Iran, a concrete and irreversible end to its capacity to weaponize fissile material, a robust system to prevent Iran from choking maritime traffic again, and enduring mechanisms to prevent proxy conflicts in the region. From Tehran's perspective, a deal that delays or dilutes nuclear limits in exchange for an immediate economic reprieve and the lifting of maritime interdictions looks tempting. Those goals are not easily reconciled. On the ground, regional players have been pulled into the orbit of mediation. Gulf states, European capitals and others have all urged restraint and pushed for mechanisms to ensure safe passage. Their interests are clear. Stability in the Strait is essential not just to their economies, but to global trade and energy security. For those capitals, the calculus is to create an international shipping regime that makes it harder for any single state to hold the world's energy supplies hostage. The immediate path forward looks narrow. Negotiations will hinge on who is willing to accept risk and who is willing to make concessions. For now, the military picture is meant to constrain Tehran. Air options, the diplomatic picture aims to provide competitive alternatives to the simple binary of blockade or capitulation. And the economic picture, the rising spectre of higher prices and storage limits, provides a timetable that makes delay costly for every side. At the heart of all this are a set of stark choices. Will pressure produce a negotiated reopening of a strategically vital shipping lane that protects nuclear non-proliferation goals? Or will short-term relief for shipping be exchanged for long-term security risks? Secretary Rubio's words in recent interviews capture the administration's reluctance to accept a deal that leaves the nuclear question unresolved. The White House's public line is similarly unambiguous. While they say a pathway to reopening the strait must be sought, it cannot come at the cost of leaving open what they view as the region's most dangerous threat. For ship owners, sailors, and the millions whose jobs are linked to the sea, the preference is a predictable, demined, and diplomatically guaranteed lane that allows commerce to flow. For national security planners on both sides of the Atlantic, the calculus is harder and colder. Trading a short-term commercial fix for long-term strategic certainty is rarely acceptable when nuclear proliferation is on the table. The coming days and weeks will matter. Naval deployments will remain a visible deterrent. Diplomatic shuttle runs to Islamabad, to Gulf capitals, and to European mediators will continue. And the storage tanks that hold the region's wealth will keep filling, setting a ticking clock on any strategy that relies on economic pain as leverage. In every direction, the Strait of Hormuz is where policy, pressure, and politics intersect, and where for now the fate of commerce, energy markets, and regional stability remains unsettled.